Hey, how's it going? This is Junior from San Jacinto Knives. I'm going to do a quick little video on some tips for the surface grinder for the TW-90 if you have it or if you're interested in it. Just some tips about how to make it work a little bit better for you, get a little bit more accurate cuts in some of your work pieces. So let me show you a few things and I'll demonstrate and show you a few things on here. First thing I want to show you in this, when you're mounting your bar here, when you got the main arm on this, sometimes that I've found that you can get a little bit crooked from one side to the other, and this is not completely square across here. It'll be a little bit tilted out. So when you're mounting this, always take a second to make sure that you've got this as flat as you can and square, because you want to eliminate as much angle in this as possible so that you don't get high sides or low sides on that. So make sure when you're doing this that you get this main arm mounted as squarely as you can. The next tip is on your dial indicator as it pertains to depth of cut. What I found is that even if, first off, you want to make sure that you're always using really sharp belts. I'm going to go against that just in this demonstration and use this worn out 60 grit belt to make a couple of roughing passes on a couple pieces that I'm working on, but I'm going to be using a sharper 120 to clean them up. But whenever you're making your cuts, I found that if I zero this out, I try to make my passes about 2/1000ths of an inch each time, which is not a lot, but you can still cut through the workpiece pretty quickly, because I'm not usually taking a whole lot off. I'm usually just trying to either get the scale off or just kind of make sure the piece is true. I stick to about 2/1000ths. You can take more, but you're running the risk of digging things out, because you can get some bogging in this. When you start pulling through, you can hang up in a different area, and while the grinder is really trying to work through that piece, you can get some low spots in there. I found that it's just a lot easier to just back off, take about 2/1000ths of an inch off each time you make through, cut through cleanly, and then just keep going that way. You'll come up with a lot more accurate work piece when you do it that way. So try to keep it to about 2/1000ths of an inch, about right like that, every time I'm making a pass. And if you do that, it pulls through a lot easier anyway. Saves your belts. You can get through more work pieces that way. And also your work piece doesn't get as hot when you do it. The next tip has to do with orientation of your work piece. You want to try to make sure that every time you put your work piece on here that you're getting it in about the same area each time. This is about a 6.5 inch work piece. I want to make sure that I'm as close as I can on either side. A lot of this stuff is probably just overthinking it, but I want to eliminate as many factors as I can and make this as accurate as I can. So when I put this workpiece on here, I'm gonna make sure that I put it on the same spot and I have about the same width here, because I want to use the exact portion of the belt each time that I'm cutting through here. The other thing that I'll do is, just like I told you with my when I trammed out my mill, it's pretty interesting that it's kind of, I didn't really even think about that, but when Travis is talking about when you get the surface grinder, the very first thing you have to do is face your table, because there's going to be some discrepancies in these steel bars here that are over your magnets. So you want to face it, and the way you face it is, well, you're running it through the table, you're running it through the grinder. What is that doing? It's using the cutting tool to square up your table, which is essentially exactly what I did with my mini mill when I used my end mill to actually face my table, so that now my table was square to my cutting tool. So not to mess with anybody on that, but it's pretty interesting that it works the exact same way. Well, in relation to the workpiece, whatever orientation that I've got here, I want to try to maintain it as much as possible. So what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that I have the same portion of this workpiece towards the top and the same portion on the bottom whenever I put this workpiece on here and take it off and put it back on. So I'm going to make a little mark, take the screwdriver and just make a little mark across the top of this. And that way when I make my passes through here, when I take this workpiece off, all I'm really going to be doing is flipping it around so that I'll have the same orientation on my workpiece, so that I can keep this within just a few thousandths of an inch across this 6-inch workpiece. Works pretty good. So let's fire this up, and I'm going to make a few passes on each side with this 60 grit belt, which is a little worn, but it still should be pretty good. And we'll see how accurate we can get this workpiece. Alright, so I took about 10 thousandths off of that side, so I'm going to swap this over. Trying to make sure I get this in roughly the same spot. That should be good there. Alright, now I'm going to take off another 10 thousandths. This is with a 60 grit belt. We're going to see how close we can get on this. It's not too hot. Let's see what you guys can see. Alright, so I'm going to try to get this to where you can see my calipers here. So I'm going to measure this top portion, this end. I'm showing 220 thousandths and 2 thousandths. See where I'm at on this end. 220 thousandths, 0.45. So there's about 2 thousandths of a difference between this end and this end, which is basically nothing at all. So let me see top and bottom here. Towards this top, I've got 22.35, 220 thousandths, and then down here, I mean that's exact. I'm within a half a thousandth from here to here, which is just ridiculous. On this side, 220 thousandths, 0.8. 220 thousandths, 0.75. So I'm about a half a thousandths off. So I'm about 2 thousandths of an inch from here to here, and about a half a thousandths on each end here, which is just really accurate. Again, this is not a fresh 60 grit belt, so pretty good stuff here. Alright, so the last tip I'm going to share with you is belt progression on this. What I've found is that you basically cannot use really fine grit belts with this. So you cannot use these J-Flex type belts like this because it's just too thin. And when that seam comes around, no matter how much you knock it down, you're going to get little divots all along your workpiece. So you just can't really do it. So what I use for most of my workpieces, that I use these are 3M 984 ceramics. I'll use a 60, then I'll use a 120, and then I'll finish it up with a Trizac. This is an A65 gator belt. This gives you a really fine finish, but what it does is the teeth on this thing, they stick up a lot higher than the seam, so you don't get that divot. This is going to come off with a really clean finish that you can start out with 320 grit with no problem to start putting your hand finishing on that if you wanted. So these are what I use: 60 grit, ceramic, 120, and then an A65 gator belt. And that pretty much gets me where I need to be to start the work on it that I'm doing. So appreciate you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next time.